You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Renee Williams of the National Center for Victims of Crime. Renee, thank you so much for joining us today on Mind Over Murder.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Can you go ahead and start by telling us a little bit about your educational and professional background, how you got into this particular role at NCVC?
It's been a slightly circuitous route here. I actually started as a theater major in undergrad, and my degree actually says acting, and that was in Pittsburgh. But while I was in acting school, I realized that was not the way I wanted to use the talents that I had been given and spend the rest of my life. So I went to law school after that and graduated from the University of Pittsburgh. Traipsed around for a while in corporate law and in litigation before becoming a nonprofit executive. And I started out at an organization called Laurel Legal Services in Pennsylvania and ended up coming to the National Center for Victims of Crime. So what I do now is a little bit of a blend of both my legal studies, but also nonprofit management.
And for anybody who does not know about the National Center for Victims of Crime, can you tell us a little bit about what services it offers and how it actually got started?
Sure. So I think for your podcast listeners, I'll take the second part of the question first because It'll be a little more interesting. We actually were founded by one of the famous true crime drama in the United States, which was the Sonny Von Bulow case. Sonny was a very wealthy heiress. She was also royalty. She had married a prince, and her second husband, Klaus Von Bulow, attempted to kill her by injecting her with insulin. He was having multiple affairs. Their story is actually told in a movie called A Reversal of Fortune. Mm-hmm. Jeremy Irons won his first Academy Award for it. He played Klaus Von Bulow, and Glenn Close played Sonny Von Bulow. But really, the good part of the story is that Sonny's children were so appalled by how they were treated throughout the justice system, because this was really before victims' rights were a movement. They took all of their inheritance to found our center. So it was originally the Sonny Von Bulow Victims Center, and it's developed. We've gone under 3 name changes, I believe, to become the National Center for Victims of Crime. But we really started as one of the first advocacy organizations in the United States to make sure that victims had a voice in the justice system and that they had rights and that those rights were acknowledged. So we've developed from that advocacy center to providing victim services as well. So we still provide some advocacy, but we also make sure that we have 2 hotlines for victims. So we're providing direct victim services, and we also train anybody who helps a victim in the justice system. So judges, police officers, anybody who sees a victim or is helping the victim through that justice process, we're in there training them, making sure they're trauma informed.
When we talk about looking for podcasts and other media outlets to be victim-focused and survivor-focused, you all are actually taking this from a much broader perspective, which is all of the components and participants in the justice system all need to be thinking about this. Are we on the right track?
Mm-hmm. So our true crime work is only a small piece of the work we do, and it actually just sprung up in the past 2 years. Really, one of our strongest suits is making sure that we are working with all victim services to make sure that they are not doing more harm to victims in the long run.
When you say they, Renee, who's the they you're referencing?
Judges, prosecutors, police officers. It's interesting because there are a lot of times, and this is not answering your question, but it's going off on a tangent on my own. I will keep under control later, but we're going to talk about this right now. There are a lot of times that you will hear people say a victim's voice is involved, and it's not truly. Prosecutors do amazing work. They work very hard. They're an integral part of the justice system, but they do not represent victims either officially in their formal tasks of being a prosecutor, but also unofficially. So a lot of times, if you're watching true crime shows or in policy decisions, folks will say, we talked to the victims because the prosecutor stepped in. Prosecutors are not trained to be victim-centered, and their job is not to represent victims. Their job is to ensure that justice is done. And so that sometimes means not prosecuting a case. That sometimes means making decisions that are adverse to what the victims might like. Police officers are the same way. And sometimes folks see those two elements as being victim-centered, but they're not. And so we do a lot of the training on how those specific groups, and really anybody within the justice system, can work with victims in a more meaningful way.
At NCVC, you have a vast array of resources that are available for anyone who's been a victim of crime. And that's either directly, like my podcast partner here, a secondary victim because he had a family member who was victimized. So what are some of the things that you as a nonprofit can offer to crime victims when they reach out to NCVC?
Again, we do have the two hotlines. One is DC based and one is national. And we have about a dozen victim assistance specialists who are trained to walk somebody through. We can do safety planning. We can point them to resources. We can explain the laws and regulations in their state to them. And we can also do warm handoffs to more local resources. We also have an attorney referral service that is available where we do try to connect victims to civil attorneys if they'd like to pursue a lawsuit. And then again, a large part of what we do is training other folks who interact with victims to make sure that there is a consistent victim experience.
One of the things that a lot of crime victims and their families may not realize that they have is a set of rights accorded to them through the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Can you discuss what are some of those rights that all crime victims are afforded? And what can NCVC do to help someone who feels that maybe those rights have been violated or not upheld to the greatest standard that they could be?
So the rights that are codified are really, unfortunately, only applicable within the justice system if there is a prosecution. Mm-hmm. By and large, those surround the right to be notified and the right to be present. You have to remember, before the 80s, a lot of times victims and their families were only viewed as witnesses. Drag somebody in, let them do a testify, and then they traipse them out. They didn't necessarily have the right to be present at all hearings. We still see quite a bit of traipsing over crime victims' rights when it involves the notification of a release. So if your perpetrator is being released, you do have a right to be notified. That often doesn't happen. And where it came up very publicly recently is in the Adnan Syed case. Mm-hmm. So that case was overturned. It wasn't overturned on anything other than the victim's family was never notified that the court was taking this action. That is an absolute core tenet. They have a right to be heard and they have a right to be present. Now, what NCVC can do if individuals feel like these rights are being violated is if they call, we can try to point them in the direction of where they can go. We can try to give them language surrounding what they need to say to trigger those rights. Unfortunately, our justice system still isn't set up for victims. So even with all of these rights, that doesn't mean that they're going to be enforced, and there's no overarching oversight body. So I get a lot of emails of people saying, this is happening to me and you should punish them. I don't have that mechanism. And unfortunately, very few things do. There are appeals courts where you can try to enforce rights. And in certain cases, there are ethics panels, but otherwise it's still tough to make sure they're enforced if they're being violated.
How the heck does stuff like this happen, Renee? Why are victims and survivors, family members, completely forgotten in this process?
I think there are two answers. First is we have a constitution that is based in defendants' rights. And I don't disagree that's correct, but I think that we've let the pendulum fly way too far onto that side.
You think?
And there's a wonderful meme out right now. It's talking about women's rights, but it actually applies to victims' rights too. And when it says women's rights, it shows the pie chart and it says, just because somebody else has rights doesn't mean you have rights taken away. This is not a pie. Mm-hmm. There's not less rights for you. And I think it's the same thing with victims' rights, but people don't quite understand that. Mm-hmm. Rights in the justice system aren't a pie. Making sure that victims' rights are enforced doesn't mean you take defendants' rights away.
Right.
But a lot of people don't see it like that. And so there's been a real focus on defendants' rights. And I would say the other issue we're seeing, and this is where I can really dork out, so stop me, give me the signal when you want to start talking. Because I've been on this topic for 10 years and I'm passionate about it. We have this thing called the justice gap in the United States. Mm-hmm. And it's when are you poor enough to get a lawyer and when are you rich enough to get a lawyer? And when you're very poor, when does the lawyer attach? All criminal defendants get a lawyer. Not going to sit here and argue about how great they are. I know. I've heard it all. I've seen bad public defenders. I've seen great public defenders. Doesn't matter. If you've committed a crime, you get a public defender. Victims don't ever get an attorney, first of all. But also, we don't get any attorney in the civil justice system. So victims of domestic violence don't necessarily get an attorney. Mm-hmm. And it matters on how poor you are. And so until that justice gap is addressed, until victims get representation in court, their rights are still going to be at play and possibly ignored.
If you were queen of the justice system, running the world, whatever you want to call it, and you could add some rights that all victims are guaranteed, what are some of the things that you would want to add that every victim is guaranteed no matter what?
The funny thing is, I think those rights are already there and they're codified. They're just not followed.
Okay.
And that is the right to have notice of any proceedings. That is the right to be present at all hearings and to at least know what is happening. The only thing I would add would be the right to have a voice in all proceedings. I don't know how we would make that happen because a prosecutor, again, does not represent the victim. They represent the state. And in a criminal case, that's going to be tough. But it's that a lot of the actual laws are already there. It's just enacting them and making sure that they are observed.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, I know Bill wants to turn here in a second. Do you feel like victims' impact statements in the courtroom, is that enough of a voice? Or does there need to be more opportunities for victims to have voices?
There need to be way more opportunities. Victim impact statements are great. They certainly allow the victim a way to heal and tell their story. And we've seen a lot of the victim impact statements do good. However, keep in mind, that's at the end of a trial. So I think victims need to have a right to have a voice at the very beginning of a trial. Is this plea bargain good? Do I agree with it?
I agree.
And that's where they're kept out.
I'm going to speak for myself here. We haven't had a single arrest yet in the Colonial Parkway murders. But even in discussing theoreticals, which make me crazy to start with, the pushback from the FBI against family participation or input, or even my sharing my thoughts, it feels like such a brick wall that the idea that, for instance, if charges are ever brought in our case, it's likely that there could be federal charges because at least 2 of the double homicides happened inside a national park and therefore would be federal charges. And then 2 of the double homicides in the Colonial Parkway murders happened outside a national park and therefore would likely be state or local charges. When I've even mentioned the possibility of speaking to the federal prosecutor about this, I get so much pushback. They're not even subtle. I already anticipate that someday, note the optimism, when arrests are made in our case, I'm fully expecting I'm going to meet that brick wall personally because that's just the way it feels. And we're only partway through, dare I say, the pursuit of justice, a word I'm not completely comfortable with. Wow, the attitude, even when I've said I'd like to speak to the federal prosecutor, they're having none of it.
What are the reasons they give? Ask the podcaster. Taking over the podcast.
Well, basically the implication, and they're clever in their phrasing, but the implication is that I have no role, that my family would have no role whatsoever in discussing how a prosecution might proceed.
It's interesting because victims are the moral core of the justice system, but we've managed to cut them out completely almost.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this idea of because they wouldn't know what they're doing and they don't know the technicalities. All true, possibly. The problem is that we've excluded individuals, but it's not making it better for anybody. The justice system is not working for anyone. The justice system does not work for those accused of crimes either. It really doesn't. And so we've created this haphazard system and we have excuses everywhere. I believe in the justice system. I believe in the promises of the Constitution. I don't think it's working the way it was meant to right now. And I think that's because we like Band-Aid approaches in the United States and we don't like to dig into the wound. And so we have this kind of house of sticks made up. And we're afraid to knock the house of sticks over, so we just patch it up where we can. One of the things that I genuinely believe is that if we paid more attention to victims and dumped 1/5 of the money that we dump into incarcerating people, if we dumped that money into victim services the minute a crime is committed and we're able to get victims help, you would start to see crime rates go down.
Why, in your opinion, would crime rates go down?
So what we know about incarceration is about 90% of the individuals who are incarcerated have been victims of crime themselves. Most of the time, they have not received services. A lot of it is domestic violence and childhood trauma, and there are very high ACEs, adverse childhood experience scores, once you start to survey incarcerated individuals. Those individuals have not been given the tools to not re-enter a cycle of violence.
And that's certainly even from when you read about, obviously, Kristin and I are following a lot of cases, not just the Colonial Parkway murders, but dozens of other cases around the country. And people approach us constantly and ask us, would we be willing to cover a particular case or discuss a particular case? But even in the consumer online reporting newspaper level, you often see that the offenders have a history of violence, and that doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from, as you're saying, households full of abuse, whether it's sexual or physical or mental. These are damaged individuals in many examples who are lashing out. I don't want to make it sound like I'm completely absolving offenders of their crimes. I'm not saying that at all. But you can see how someone that's been through what they've been through ends up lashing out and hurting people in some way.
And it's a very delicate conversation to have. There are a lot of individuals in the victim services world that get very unhappy when you say things like hurt people. So we try to avoid saying that.
I'm speaking as the brother of a murder victim. I don't know what other term you want me to use.
And that's the thing is, so a lot of folks will kick back and say, Bill, you're a great example. Yes, I was hurt, but I didn't go do harm. And so it's not an excuse. That is correct. But we also know how trauma works. And if you don't address a pain immediately and you allow things to fester, you can't predict which way somebody is going to go. We get asked a lot. I get asked a lot when we're speaking because we do a lot of prison reform, what my views are on mandatory minimums, what my views are on mandatory maximums. And I'm against mandatory anythings. I don't believe that either works because I think you have to look at the person. And that's what you have a judge there for, is to look at each person. But I will say that a lot of people try to say there's absolute evil in this world. I don't quite believe that. And I think that you can't make snap decisions on anybody. But I do think that if we addressed victimization and trauma at its genesis, when it first happens, you would start to see the level of at least violent crime go down. And it would take decades. It would not be this would not be, oh, look, Renee was right, or we watched the crime rates drop this year. It would take decades. I think that it's so cyclical when you're talking about violence, crime, and victimization.
But what would you have me say different when I say hurt? Is there another word that's somehow more acceptable?
It would not even be, no, and it wouldn't be that I would have, I'm trying to think of how to say this. it wouldn't even be the word. It's not how to say it. It's that there are many victim advocates who would say, but I was hurt and I did not. That's the sensitive point for a lot of individuals.
Renee, I want to take a second and talk about the last place where we saw you, which was at CrimeCon in Orlando, which it feels much longer ago than it actually was. It's only a couple of weeks. And you moderated a wonderful panel at CrimeCon with my podcast partner, Bill Thomas. So I want to talk about the panel, but I also am just curious, who reached out first? Did CrimeCon reach out to you? Did you reach out to them? Like, how did this partnership come into being?
I think it was mutual, maybe. Kim Goldman and Jim Clement, who are very involved in CrimeCon, are both on our board of directors. Mm-hmm. And so last year, when we were trying to think of ways to get the NCBC name out, in a board meeting, CrimeCon came up as an idea. And so I believe Kim reached out to the CrimeCon folks and said, you asked me to speak this year, but you have to have Renee too. And they very graciously accepted. And so I got to moderate 2 panels last year, and we got invited back this year.
Mm-hmm. Kristin and I had both seen Kim speak at CrimeCon a couple of years ago. I want to say that was in Nashville, but I remember it was a packed ballroom, and she's an amazing speaker. Of course, she spoke about losing her brother, Ron, to a violent crime, and she's a tremendous advocate. I didn't get a chance to say hello to her, but I just walked away completely blown away by how passionate and incredibly well-spoken she was. So I want to be Kim Goldman when I grow up.
Me too. And her hair is perfect. And I had this discussion with her once because it was 7 a.m. We were at a conference and she walked in and her hair was perfect. And she gave me her tips. None of them have worked for me. But yes, I also would like to be Kim Goldman when I grow up.
I'm not going to worry about the hair thing. It's too far gone.
So the panel that you moderated, which Bill also attended, was 8 rules for being an ethical true crime fan. And as soon as I heard that topic, Bill called me and said, hey, guess what? I'm getting to do a panel. I get to do it with Kathy Kleiner. I get to do it with Brian, and I get to do it with Renee Williams. I'm so excited. I said, what's it about? He said, 8 rules for being an ethical true crime fan. And I said, that is great. I can get behind that. Can you... A, tell us how did that come about, and B, can you do the rules, please?
So how it came about was last year when we went to CrimeCon, we were so embraced by the true crime community, but there was a lot of confusion, and people were asking questions about how can I be good true crime consumers. And so I started to dig into what was happening in the true crime world, and I found a lot of really good things, and I found a lot of really appalling things. Mm-hmm. Everybody, and not to knock this podcast, I think the world of you both, but there are a few others, and Bill and I have had this conversation, so I feel safe saying this. There are a few others that you give somebody a mic and a Wikipedia page and they think they're a true crime expert.
Ouch.
And
Yep. Thank you.
It's terrifying to me, but to be fair, my first thought was, why can't they follow the rules? And then I thought, because there are no rules out there.
Exactly.
And so can't get mad at people for not following the rules of the road if you don't give them the rules of the road. So we thought, how do we do this? And how do we start to make the change in this community in ways that are meaningful and non-judgmental and are actually achievable? And so we have 2 other media guides coming out. One is for victims, how to navigate the media. And one is for all content creators. Now, we had media guides for a long time, but they were for journalists who are bound by their own rules. And so we thought, what if there are people that just want to do a good job, but they've not had to take an ethics course? So we are trying to give them a crash course, not in ethics, but in how can I speak to victims? And if I got into true crime to do good, to tell somebody's stories, how can I do that in a way that does not either do harm to the investigation or further traumatize folks? Part of that was also coming up with rules for the public of how they can be true crime consumers. And again, that was because we had such a good experience last year and people so fully embraced it that we thought if we could get some folks' attention around this, I bet we can start to make some changes.
And I love that concept because you're right. It is a wonderful, warm loving community for the most part of people who really want to try to do good. There are a couple of people out there who are like determined to be chaos and cause trouble, but I would say any community has those. It is so nice to know that there is this set of rules out there, and I'm hoping that at some point or another we can all kind of embrace that so that it just becomes like these are the standard norms by which we operate.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Can you go over those 8 rules real quick, and then we can get into more of them in more detail?
Sure. So these are the rules for the general public when consuming, not necessarily podcasters, because we're hoping the general public will take it and say, hey, we are not going to listen to this anymore if you are not being ethical. So the first is there is no such thing as victimless true crime.
We're both giving that a big thumbs up.
Yep.
The second is there is no timeline for trauma. The third is investigate. The fourth is require the presence of victims' voices.
I can get behind that one too.
Yeah, very much.
The fifth is do no harm. The sixth is respect boundaries. The seventh is don't fall victim yourself to true crime. And the eighth is turn your interest into impact. Now, I flew through those, but you guys know that there are long explanations to each. So where do we want to start unpacking?
Yes. The main touchstone out of this is the very, very first one. So let's start there. There is no victimless true crime. So why is it that there are victims who get written out of their own stories? We were talking about this with Kathy Kleiner the other day, when she's talking about the fact that Ted Bundy is of vastly more interest than his victims are. And like, why? He was a loser. He was not charismatic. He was not handsome. He was not charming. He was not smart. And yet here we have so many people interested in him. And even those types of people who show up at CrimeCon who are interested in him. Why aren't we focusing more on the victims? Talk to us a little bit more about the fact that there really is no victimless true crime.
We're not watching true crime stories about pyramid schemes. Netflix and its progeny will release one every so often, but I don't even think they get high reviews. They're boring. Let's be honest. They are. The crimes that are intriguing individuals and have intrigued us since the beginning of time are those with victims of violent crimes, almost always and exclusively. But I think our psyche, especially now, allows us to turn that into a story and a form of entertainment. So you can then take a victim and make them a character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ted Bundy himself is not Ted Bundy the person. He is Ted Bundy the character. And that's what intrigues people. Nobody actually likes Ted Bundy that knew him. But we've allowed this storyline to arc around and move to where he's sexy and romantic and misunderstood. None of which is true.
And smart and oh so clever.
Yes,
and
handsome and charming. And he was a wonderful stepfather. Ted Bundy was an amazing human, except for that inconvenient fact that none of those things were true. And he was a killer. But with the amount of media that's out there and the stories and the books and everything that's allowed to encapsulate him, he gets this weird halo glow and we're not looking at him as a person. And so that's why he becomes so much more intriguing. Where his victims, if we can turn a victim into a character, they become maybe slightly more interesting, but there's something very real about victims. And there's something very deep that they're harder to turn into just characters. And that starts to feel a little bit less comfortable and it's a little bit less fun to hear about. I want to hear about people in the hospital and what they had to overcome and talk about their therapy.
I also think that some of the crossover between the world of fiction and nonfiction, it gets very blended. Keeping in mind that if, for instance, if you're going to tell a story about a serial killer or a repeat offender of some sort, the victim is introduced, however briefly, and then he or she, quite often it's she, is then something terrible happens to them, and then they're actually eliminated basically from their own story because there's very little reference made to them after that. And then in a typical serial killer type story, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, then there's another victim introduced. But they almost become like dominoes or something. They're just being stacked up, knocked over, next. And there's a diminishment of their humanity because they're just briefly introduced, killed off, and then we're on to the next victim. You're absolutely right. We've been doing this for hundreds, if not thousands of years, since all the way back to the penny press, when people wanted to read about Jack the Ripper or whomever. The protagonist, the offender, becomes the through line, and not hero necessarily, but they're definitely pushing the story forward. I think what happens in true crime now is that we're picking up a lot of those tropes from fictional stories or stories that have been around for so many hundreds of years that people forget that Jack the Ripper actually was a real life serial killer.
It's interesting. So my favorite actor in the world is Patrick Page, the very famous Broadway actor. And he's doing a show right now called All the Devils Are Here. It's off Broadway.
Oh, I've heard about this.
Oh my God. So I went to see it before it opened because I'm obsessed with him. But he talks about Shakespeare's invention of the villain, and what the villain was before Shakespeare came along was very caricature and dramatic and weird, where Shakespeare took the villain, and villain didn't mean evil. I can't remember what it meant, but it meant something else. But he took the villain and made it psychological, and actually several of Shakespeare's villains are sociopaths. But he talks about it that's part of why Shakespeare became so popular, because in his villains, we found such complex characters that we psychologically feel the need to understand. And I think that's what we see with serial killers that we are now idolizing, is we view them as these psychologically complex humans, and we're trying to understand them. Yeah. And part of it's that we think we could never do that. And part of it's trying to understand what they are doing. And then part of it's, I think, a desperate belief that nobody could ever just be that evil without some underlying tragedy or story or backstory. And so that's why the killers are so interesting. Meanwhile, victims are everyday people, and we're not trying to sort them out.
No, exactly. I am curious, before we go back into the rules, I'm really curious, out of the panelists that you had available to you for this panel at CrimeCon, did you get to choose who your panelists were, or were you told these are your panelists, please work with them?
Oh no, CrimeCon was very lovely. They let me put together, I asked them if I could have a 1-hour topic, the topic of my choosing and the method and madness of my choosing. And they told me to basically do what I wanted. And so I got to pick the individuals.
Okay.
The topic, everything.
I'm just going to put Bill on the spot here for a second. Why was Bill a really good choice for your panel?
Bill was a very good choice because he both knows the world professionally and what it takes to get into it and the pitfalls, but also how it feels on the other end. And it was very important to me. And that's also why Brian and Kathy were included. Kathy's story and her way of telling it is beautiful and amazing, but it is one-sided, and it had to be one-sided, right? Like, it's not her job to know what the media does. Brian Edton is the same way. He is going to be one-sided and say, this is what I do. So I needed both of them. And then Bill bridged them both.
Love that.
And that was very important, because I think when you're doing a panel like this, if you actually want people to hear what you're saying, you can't just come at it from one side, because you give people the opportunity to write off what you've said if there's any gap. So if it was just victims on that stage with me, the audience could say, that's fine that victims feel this way, but what are people supposed to do? Well, then you have somebody sitting there this is what you're supposed to do. And by the way, we know how to do it because we do it every day.
On a personal note, I just like to say I'm really disappointed that I wasn't brought in because I'm the personification of evil. which is really my goal.
You have the voice for it.
Oh, I love that. Yes.
And Halloween is coming up within days at the time of this taping.
The number of times that people are like, oh, your voice is like silk. It's like satin. It's like olive oil. But I've never heard someone say his voice is the voice of evil. And I love it. I love it. Every single, I'm going to use that every single time someone talks about how smooth and charming and lovely his voice is made for radio. I'm going to come back with yes, but he also sounds like the personification of evil. I love it.
Look, we all have goals and aspirations, and until I get that booking as the personification of evil, my work here will not be done.
You got to play an evil elf in Santa Maybe, right? You're getting there.
One of our friends, Jason Usry, asked me to play part in his wonderful Christmas production of Santa Maybe. And originally I was going to be an elf, which I was real happy to be an elf. And so I was working on my elfing. And then he said, oh, we've got this guy who's like a real sort of Hollywood sleaze kind of guy. And I said, oh, I can do that. That's me. I can do that.
My horse's name is Vincent Price, and I've been looking for a voiceover for him.
Oh, I love Vincent
Like whenever
Price.
I want to post him on Instagram, because I feel like he has a voice and he's just waiting to use it. So I can offer you that role.
Absolutely.
There we go. I love that. And I love the fact I think you did choose the best set of panelists possible for your 8 Rules panelist. And I know I'm a little biased because he's my partner and all that, but I really think you made some excellent choices there. And it was a hit. It was a really excellent panel. And I honestly think that more people could have benefited from seeing and hearing it on like a larger stage.
The great news is it's still available, and actually NCVC has posted it on our website. The entire
wow.
show.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
We got permission from CrimeCon to use it. So we have the video, and the video is up. So if any of your listeners would like to watch Bill in live, not live and not in person, but on a video.
You want to hear from Kathy Kleiner-Rubin and Brian Enton, too. They're both amazing. And each of them brings their own incredible background to the table.
So after your time at CrimeCon, did you have any feedback from participants or discussion with people there that really struck a chord with you, Renee, or anything that you took away that you're still mulling over even all this many weeks later?
I know a lot of individuals said that it really changed the way they viewed true crime. I was approached in the hallway and asked, because one of the topics that we discussed and went on a little bit of a bandwagon about was the sharing on social media. And don't share. Why are you sharing? Think before you comment, think before you post. And somebody approached me and actually asked, aren't we being helpful if we share? And I had to walk her through the ways that sharing was not always helpful. But I think to some extent, it just affirmed that people are doing this to be helpful. Just because they're not helpful in the way that we want them to be helpful, that can't take away their intention. It just maybe needs to be redirected. I will tell you, I have been contacted by a victim whose story was told. Her mother was killed and her story was told on Oxygen, and she was not contacted, had no idea it was going out. A friend of the family saw the previews and saw some pretty gruesome photos. So she contacted me for help. And I think this bleeds into there's no timeline for trauma. I think it had happened in the 1980s. So the producers thought it was not a big deal. And for her, it was very traumatic. And I think hearing from her after we did this was further affirmation. Because when you put things like this out, you're not sure if you're exactly right on. You do all of the work you can as far as roundtables, but you're not sure you've encompassed everything. Or in my mind, sometimes I think I'm being overly dramatic about something and I'm too focused on one thing and not focused enough. So I think her reaching out really just confirmed the prevalence of we've got to protect these individuals. Because I will tell you, she had nowhere to turn. I frankly did not know that I'd be able to help her at all. I got lucky on helping her. But when she first emailed me, I thought, shoot, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help you. And if I don't know how to help you, we're in a world of trouble because that means there's no one who can. But you clearly need the help. Her reaching out affirmed a lot of this and also made me realize there's a lot more work to be done, because if I'm going to put myself on a stage and put out a video and sit on podcasts about the wonderful work we're doing, I better be able to help somebody in that position too. And her email sent me for a loop.
What words do you have for anyone who has been a victim of crime and who needs support? And if they don't know where to go, we're not going to say everybody should just email Renee because you are very busy. What would you say to anybody who just, I don't know where to go, but I know that I need some help? Where would you point them?
I would honestly start by calling our victim services hotline.
Okay.
There are so many different paths for victims. So there are places where you cannot get a victim advocate unless you're cooperating with law enforcement. And maybe you don't want to cooperate with law enforcement for a multitude of reasons. There are a lot of victims that rely on their friends and family, which is wonderful for emotional support, but does not provide a level of expertise or closure that some individuals need. Start with our victim services hotline, but also know that there's not one right path and that a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about what you should and shouldn't do. And none of those are right if they're not right for you.
Yeah, one of the things I've learned over time, even with the 8 families in the Colonial Parkway murders and talking to victims and survivors of other crimes, is that everyone's different and the impact of these terrible events will be different and may even be different over time. Our case stretches back 37 years now, so we're seeing even generationally things shift in terms of the impact of this series of violent crime. One of the things I say to Kristin is your mileage may vary. It may sound a little flip, but what I mean is that everyone is going to deal with this trauma in their own way. And even over the course of their lives, this will stay with them forever. It isn't the situation is resolved, a suspect is identified, tried, convicted, and everything in your life just goes on perfectly because nothing's ever going to change what's happened.
Mm-hmm. And our justice system is woefully unable to help victims all of the time. Sometimes you have to accept that resolution and closure is not going to come through the justice system. It's just not. You have to find another form of justice or find some closure that is going to work for you. We see this a lot in, frankly, victims of child sex abuse. They know who did it. It was in the 1980s. It was a family member. And they come to us with paperwork and their hat in their hands, begging for help. And the answer is just, this isn't something that the justice system can address. With a lot of victims, with domestic violence, with multiple victims cases, it's just something that the justice system is not set up to address. For nobody's fault. You have to have multiple pathways if you want closure, because it's not always going to come from one path.
And almost everyone I know that's been through this, whether they have had suspects identified or not, whether they've been through a trial or not, everyone I've met so far, which is probably in the hundreds now, every single person I've talked to makes some sort of analogy about the fact that they feel like they've been through a meat grinder and that there's a process, but at the end of it, something awful, us, gets spat out at the other end. No one I've met yet has expressed anything more than a smidgen of satisfaction or feeling like whatever we call this thing, that they somehow achieved justice. That's twice now I've used that word, which is a word I'm not crazy about because I'm not seeing any.
Mm-hmm.
And even the people I know whose cases have been adjudicated and seen all the way through, no one has ever said to me yet, I felt like I achieved some level of satisfaction or, dare I say, justice again. It just doesn't seem to be part of the process.
And there are times when the justice system can make things worse. When you are parading out every intimate detail in public, in a courtroom, whether it's about a family member who has died, or if you're a victim of a violent crime, and the defense has the right to ask you the whys, and they can get ugly.
What would you like to see change in the true crime space in the next couple of years to help us reach a point where we are more friendly and aware of victims and what we need to be doing to help them?
I think we start with consumers who care, who are holding the content creators accountable. And I think that consumers in the true crime field don't realize how powerful they are. And they think that just one view on the Netflix or one listen to a bad podcast doesn't really mean anything. It does. And if people start reaching out and saying, I don't want to hear this unless you're doing this, things will start to change. But again, it's getting the awareness out there. At CrimeCon, I will tell you, I did talk to one podcast team who literally told me they did not care about having the victim's voice. They're just doing it for fun. I'm not going to say it.
Wow.
We're just here to have a good time. We don't want to get into that. And I said to them, you literally just told me you don't care about having the victim's voice or discussing anything with accuracy. No, we don't. We're just here to have fun. It's just fun. We're just trying to have fun with it. We're not trying to get into the serious part of it. And I was like, you're doing a podcast about murder. You're getting into the serious part of it. So I would love to see folks like that run out of town. And I do think that consumers have the ability to do it. And I think that's where we start, with people viewing every single thing they watch that's in this space, not as a story that they're being told, but as something that actually happened, and the victims as individuals who need some sort of help, or that something awful happened to them, but viewing them as real people.
I can't think of a better note to end on than that one. Renee Williams, thank you so very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.